Right. So, in today's video, I'm going to discuss about the technology architecture part. Because as we all know, whenever we are working on application development, understanding our enterprise architecture followed by the solution architecture is essentially important. In context to that, in reference to the enterprise architecture and all, one of the major framework which normally we use is called Togaf, because Togaf is an open group application framework, an open group framework, which majorly used to develop enterprise architecture and all everything for the organization level whenever we try to create a roadmap for any of the project to understand it. In reference to that, today I'm going to explain you about what is technology architecture is all about and how technology architecture majorly make us to understand about on a high level note where you can see over here. So whatever the technology architecture are we going to develop in reference to the architectural perspective, majorly categorized into different parts. The first one about the development perspective, wherein you can see here. At the same time, second, in reference to the draft architecture perspective. At the same time, whatever the architectural principles are we going to develop in this. So followed by this, we need to understand the clear understanding over the updating the stakeholders, at the same time statement of architecture work and all everything are 4 layers. So whenever we are trying to develop any kind of architecture in reference to the technological perspective and all, these are the four different layers which normally we have. One is about the development layer, which normally we see. Second about one is about architectural definition documentation. This is where it was. Second, architecture requirement specification, followed by architecture principles and so on. Now, let us understand about how generally architectural definition document is what something will be created. So whenever we try to understand about the technical architecture and all, first of all, try to understand enterprise architecture in 4 levels. So when you try to understand about enterprise architecture, this is categorized into 4 different parts. One is about business architecture, majorly focusing on business goal, vision, mission, strategies, right? So business objectives, what is that we want to achieve everything. Next, we call it as application architecture. Whatever the different applications are we using within the organization and how these applications were interconnected and interrelated. Next, technology architecture, or it can be like infrastructure architecture, I can say. What are the infrastructure are we using to manage the applications, or when we are developing in new applications and all, how these technologies were interconnected or interrelated. This is where generally technology architecture come into existence. So once technology architecture, the next one we call it as DA, which stands for data architecture, how the data pipeline streamline process is going on, how the streamline of data we are transforming from one extent to another extent, how the data flow process happens and all. This is all something comes under data architecture. So when we are trying to understand and implement Togaf in reference to the enterprise architecture perspective, it's always evident and it's always important for us to understand about 4 areas. One is business architecture, applications, technology, and the data architecture. Now, whatever are we going to discuss is something relating to the technical perspective, technical architecture. Now, when we try to understand about the technical architecture from the understanding level perspective, this is where something we need to identify the kind of responsibilities which normally stakeholders will be provided for the technical architecture, because stakeholders will have different perceptions. Stakeholders will have different assumptions in reference to the application solution we are going to develop with. So in regard to that, it's always understand and identify what could be the responsibilities which stakeholders is trying to see, especially from the technical perspective, is what something will be taken into the first level. This is the first case which normally we do that. Next, once that, after that, we need to develop a baseline technical architecture, which majorly consists of the technologies we are trying to implement in it. Whatever the baseline architecture we try to enhance in order to improve the performance of the applications, because scalability, load balancing, fault tolerancing, reachability, availability, all these are the essential elements which we are categorizing and which we are identifying this through non-functional requirements whenever we have gathered initial requirements from the customer. So it's always important based upon the identification of the responsibilities from the stakeholder perspective. So being into architecture level, when we are trying to implement this Togaf enterprise architecture, all that, it's always evident and important for us to understand and develop baseline architectures from the technical perspective is something we must be knowing with. So once we try to understand about developing a baseline technology architecture and all that, this is something which we have to lead it to the target architecture. This is where generally this developing target technology architecture is something which we have to be focused more on. So baseline architecture, which majorly gives us about high level understanding over the architecture, what is that we have understood from the technical perspective. So followed by this, equally, we need to understand about what kind of target architecture do we require to develop in order to understand about two different things. One is about as is and second is to be. As is nothing but the existing system which customer is using. Proposed system is what something we call it as to be system. That's what generally we call it as is to be process is concerned. So in that regard, it's always important for us to understand gap analysis. This is where generally gap analysis come into picture. Because gap analysis is a one type of analysis we do where we try to identify the gaps between as is and to be process. As is nothing but the existing system, as is stated some time back, to be nothing but the one you are going to develop. So when you are trying to understand between these two, these gaps can be falls under the functional related stuff, non-functional, security related, or user interface related stuff and all. So that is where generally this performing gap analysis is something essentially required when we are trying to understand about the technology, because we are building a technology, we are implementing the technology for a new application. It's always important for us to understand the existing infrastructure or the application or the architecture or the infrastructure which customer is using for a very long time. Because sometimes we need to develop an existing application where we need to add some new features and functionalities to the existing one. Or else we need to develop a new application where we have to be taken this data migration and all everything in this context. Hence, performing gap analysis is one of the key and prominent element which we have to be focused more on. So once performing gap analysis, the next we need to perform impact analysis. To what extent it is getting impacted? Because impact analysis is what something we have to see, because how it is getting impacted when we are working on the project, in what way it is getting impacted. So we should understand how this is being impacted when we are working on the application development front. This is where we have to see in reference to the performance impact. Because performance impact, this is where non-functionalities we take into consideration. Because when we are working on a solution architecture, when we are trying to understand about enterprise solution architecture at enterprises, we need to understand the performance as well. This is where non-functionality come into existence. How performance the application was earlier and how application performance must be now, as well as in future. This is where generally performing impact analysis is what something we have to do. Now, so for that, there are something where we need to prepare some documentation of requirements. This is where generally we have to be prepared with. Because technology domain related requirements is what something will be prepared technical specifications, because we have to create required technical specifications which are essentially important when we are working on application development. So because these requirement specification documents and all everything, something essentially important as well as make technical team to understand about requirements from the document perspective, so that it will be an evidence for us to refer if there is any complexity we have identified while we are developing or implementing the project and all. If there is any references to be taken and all, this documentation and all everything is what something will be seen. At the same time, we have to validate, because we have to validate technology principles, whatever the principles, because there are IT principles and technology principles which we have to incorporate it in the project. So when we are doing so, how to validate the technology principles is what something we have to consider. So when we are trying to understand about stakeholder requirements and all that stuff, right? So these are the elements which we have to be focused when we are working on this level. At the same time, when there is any baseline architecture we have developed, when there is a targeted architecture was developed here, It's always important for us to perform gap analysis followed by impact analysis is something essentially required. The next was we need to finalize the architectural definition document. This is where generally architectural definition document come into picture. Because when we are developing architectures for enterprise level transformation, the first stage is what this. This is what generally the first one. Yeah, this is what generally the first one, right? Architectural definition document is what something we have to be prepared with. So once architectural definition document is prepared, we need to have an architecture requirement specification as well as the kind of draft model of the document which is required as is stated, which normally this architectural definition document will be converted into architecture requirement specification, right? So because high level requirements, low level requirements, at the same time, whatever the requirements are we going to develop from the technical perspective, all these things are comes under architecture requirement specification, which majorly deals with the kind of technology we are using against to the requirements, what is that we have taken and all these things are comes under architecture requirement specification. So followed by this, we have to implement. This is where generally, as I told you, validating IT principles as well as technology principles are one of the key element. This is the third level. This is the third level where we are trying to understand about architectural principles and all. So based on the architectural principles, whatever we have identified, whatever the document in reference to the architectural definition document we have identified and we have prepared so far, that we have to be confirmed, right? So because whatever the work we are about to develop and all everything, so that we have to confirm from the confirmation statement, right? So confirmation statement where we have to confirm to what extent it is required and what is that it is essentially in it. This is where generally this confirmation statement architecture is what something we develop. Finally, it will be landed with statement architecture work is what generally we have to be performed with. This is how and what generally, whenever we are preparing Togaf technology architecture and all, whenever try to understand about technology architecture in reference to the Togaf and all everything, this is what and how usually we try to develop technology architecture and all everything in this perspective. I hope you got an idea, right? So what exactly technology architecture and all about all that, right? So next session, I'm going to discuss about the remaining architectures, which are essentially required when we want to develop and implement Togaf in reference to the enterprise level frameworks and all. Okay, thank you. Bye.